get started. Okay, so perfect, great, right? So let's do a quick recap of what we have done in the last class, and then we'll move forward from there. Great. So in yesterday's class, we talked about price elasticity of demand, and today we'll talk about unique cases of price elasticity of demand. Now, a quick recap of what exactly is PED, right? So we say PED, which is the short form of price elasticity of demand. It is a formula that captures the responsiveness of demand for any product with regards to change in its price, right? So due to change in product price, how much will be the change in its demand? That is what PED captures, price elasticity of demand, right? Now, the way we calculate this, as we have seen, as we saw yesterday, percentage change in quantity demanded of the good, right? So QD is quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. So this delta, which might be a new thing for you, right, is simply showing change. So this delta means change, right? So you can write it like this as well. So you could have also written this as percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. That would have made absolutely no difference. So you don't need to worry about it, right? So as long as you know the formula, you're good, right? The notation doesn't makes any difference, right? Okay, now this being said, now we said that how much responsive is demand with regards to price, that is what price elasticity of demand determines, right? Then we talked about a couple of different factors that affect price elasticity of demand, right? In which it was, the first one was necessity versus luxury. So if something is factors affecting PED, right? So if a product is a necessity, right? So if a product is a necessity, that will be inelastic. Why? Because just think about it. When fuel gets expensive, when food becomes expensive, right? People still consume more or less same quantity, right? So whether food is becoming expensive, fuel is becoming expensive, people still consume more or less same quantity, right? So if something is a necessity, it will be less elastic. If it's a luxury, right, which means that you have options for that. Luxury is something that you don't need badly, you can live without it, right? So therefore, luxury items will have more elastic demand, necessity will have less elastic demand. Then another factor that affect price elasticity of demand was number of substitutes. We did talk about this a couple of times, right? You more substitutes mean it's more elastic, less substitutes means it's less elastic. Then how much urgent is the need, right? So if you urgently need something, right, then it will be less elastic or inelastic, as we say. If it's not that urgent, it will be more elastic. And then the final thing that we talked about was proportion of income spent on the good, right? So if you're spending a big proportion of your income on something, would that be more elastic or less elastic? Khadija? So if you're spending big proportion of your income on something, right, would that be more elastic or less elastic? What do you think? What do you remember from the classes? Right, if you're spending a big proportion of your income on a good, would that be more elastic, less elastic? That will be more elastic. Excellent, because that's taking a big chunk of your income. Okay, now today we said we will talk about unique cases of PED, right? Unique case of price elasticity of demand. Zwan, how are you? So before that, let's do a recap of what we have so far, done, right? So we said that, like yesterday, we talked about only two cases. So far we know only about two cases of price elasticity of demand. One, which is more elastic, or as we say, elastic, and one was less elastic or inelastic, right? So it's more elastic or elastic, as we say, and then it's less elastic or inelastic, right? But there are some other cases as well that we are about to discuss today, right? More elastic, less elastic, inelastic. Now, yesterday, if you remember, we also talked about the values. We said that if PED value is less than 1, if PED value is less than 1, that's less elastic or inelastic. If the value is greater than 1, ignoring the negative sign, that's more elastic, right? Do you remember? We talked about this, right? Walaikum assalam, Zwan, how are you? I'm good, right? So far we have only discussed two cases of elasticity: more elastic, which is also known as elastic, or less elastic, which is also known as inelastic. Today we'll talk about some other cases of elasticity as well. Great. Okay, now let's make this a little Interesting. And let's say there is this demand curve that looks like this, right? So let me make the demand curve first, and then I'll ask you that what this demand curve is actually showing you, right? So just like any other demand curve, you will have price per unit on the y-axis, and you will have quantity demanded on the x-axis, right? So if the demand curve looks like this, if the demand curve looks like this, first of all, tell me, is it even possible to have a demand curve like this? What do you think? Can you imagine the product demand to be like this? Okay, Khizr, can you give me an example? So Khizr is of the opinion that yes, demand curves can look like this, right? Okay, can you give me an example? What products will have a demand curve like this? What real life products, if you can give me one or two examples, would have a demand curve like this, right? Okay, inelastic. Give me a real life example. Yeah, one. Bread, okay, makes sense to an extent. Yeah. Medicines is a better example. Yeah, true. Okay, have a look at this. So students, think about this. Petrol, yeah, can be, can be. Okay, the first thing that you have to understand, right, Khadija, think about this. So what it actually shows that you have price on the y-axis, quantity demanded on the x-axis, just like any other demand curve. Let's first interpret what this demand curve is showing, right? So what this demand curve is actually showing us is that regardless of the price, so whatever the price is, let's say even if the price, let's say initially the price was $10 and you were demanding 100 units of the good, then the price increased because you're going up on the y-axis. You're going up on the y-axis, so we know when you go up on the y-axis, the prices are increasing, right? Yes or no? So prices are increasing, but you're not moving on the x-axis. Neither you're moving to the right on the x-axis, neither nor you're moving left on the x-axis. The quantity demanded is fixed regardless of the price of the good. So what it actually shows that this is something that is too much of a necessity, and you always need this in fixed quantities. Khizr, nothing but this. This is something that you always need in fixed quantity. Whether it's expensive or it's less expensive, you will always demand this fixed quantity, no matter what. Now, if you take the example of a bread, so bread, petrol was, I mean, a close example, but still that's not a very good example. Khizr, why? Because think about this. If let's say petrol becomes cheap, then people will buy a little more. Perhaps how will they buy a little more? Let me tell you. So some people who currently do not have generators, especially in country like Pakistan, right, where electricity is a problem, right? Then they can perhaps think about having a generator at home in case there is a shortage of electricity. They can generate their own electricity and stuff like that, right? So people might start buying more fuel because it's cheaper and so on. Similarly, when fuel prices drop, what some people might do is that they can buy additional cars because now having a private car is not that expensive. So for products like petrol and even for products like bread, right, people do respond to changes in prices. People do respond to changes in prices, but a better example for a demand curve that is a straight vertical line like the one that I've drawn for you, right? So for a demand curve that looks like a straight vertical line, something that you always need in fixed quantity. Like think about this, insulin, right? So what is insulin, right? Insulin is a medical drug or a medicine, simply speaking, that doctors prescribe to diabetic people, right? Diabetes, you might have heard, right? It's kind of, in simple words, we say sugar, right? So to diabetic people. Now you have to put, if doctor has recommended you one injection per day, then it will always be one injection, right? Nothing more, nothing less. So whether it's becoming expensive or it's becoming cheaper, you have to get this one injection daily, right? So anything that's, or other medicines as well, generally, not only this medicine, other medicines as well, right? So whether it's more expensive or it's less expensive, you always have to demand this quantity. Khizr, Khatija, Zohan, is this clear? Right? But obviously, I do realize that petrol and what was the other thing? Petrol and bread would be better examples of inelastic. So those are more of inelastic, right? So their demand doesn't change a lot because they are also kind of a necessity. Bread is a basic food item, so it's it will definitely have inelastic demand, but not perfectly inelastic. So the name that we give to this type of demand curve, it's known as, students, think about this. What do we call that? This is known as perfectly inelastic demand curve. So this means that the demand is not changing no matter what. The demand is not changing no matter what. Got it? Students, are you clear? Very nice. Excellent. Perfectly inelastic demand. Good. Can we move on? Okay. Now let's talk about the value of this demand curve. So what will be the value of this demand curve? Now I'll give you some hints and you have to tell me. Think about this. So demand is not changing. Could you see? The demand is not changing. So demand, quantity demand is fixed. So the percentage change in demand would be what? What will be the percentage change in demand if demand is not changing at all? How do you calculate the percentage change in 100 minus 100? It turns out to be 0, right? So the change in demand is 0. So percentage change in demand is 0, right? Now, no matter what the change in price is, so 0 divided by 5, or 0 divided by 6, or 0 divided by 10, or 0 divided by 0.6, right? No matter what number you divide 0 with any number, it will always turn out to be 0, right? Yes or no? If there is nothing to divide, then overall value will also be 0, right? You can also use a calculator for that if you want to, right? So mathematically, the value of price elasticity of demand for a demand curve like this is perfectly inelastic demand, and the PED value will turn out to be 0 because there is no change in demand. The demand is not changing at all. Easy? So PED would be equals to 0. How many of you got this? Price elasticity of demand value of this demand curve, which is known as perfectly inelastic demand, would always be equals to 0. Can we move on, students? We good? Can we move on? Khadija, is it? Okay. Now there's another unique case of price elasticity of demand that we're about to discuss, right? Let me show you over here, right? Now another unique case of price elasticity of demand looks like this. It looks like this, right? Okay. So this is the shape of another type of price elasticity of demand, another type of demand curve, right? Okay, perfect, very nice. So on the y-axis, you have price per unit of the good, price per unit, and on the x-axis, you have quantity demanded, right? Okay. Now this being said, let's interpret first that what this demand curve is showing us, right? So you have price on the y-axis, right? As I've told you, so at this point, let's say the price is $10, $11, whatever, right? And quantity demanded is on the x-axis like always, right? Now what it actually shows that the price is staying fixed, but you can demand as much quantity as much you wish to, right? So at $10, you can buy 100 units of the good. At $10 per unit, you can buy 200 units of the good. At $10 per unit, you can buy 300 units of the good, and so on and so forth. So before this, we have never seen a demand curve that looks like this, because we were always used to making a demand curve like a straight down sloping line. Yes or no? Did I tell you or not that the law of demand always holds true? But that's why we say that these are unique cases, because sometimes that's not true. Sometimes that's not true, right? So is everyone clear on this? So for a demand curve that's a straight horizontal line, what it actually shows that your price is not changing. So in the previous case, the demand was not changing, price was changing. In this case, the price is fixed, price is not changing, but your demand is changing. Right? Yes or no? Got it? Okay. Now, we will study more about this type of demand curve in A2, but let me tell you a little bit about what this demand curve is. So the name that we give to this demand curve, first of all, is known as perfectly elastic. So the previous one was perfectly inelastic, and this one is called perfectly elastic demand. Now, what type of products will have a demand curve like this? Okay, now let me ask you a simple question. Have you ever gone with your parents? Have you ever accompanied your parents when they go doing grocery, right? In Pakistan, at least, we have this farmer market, Atwar Bazaar, right? Juma Bazaar, right? So what happens over there, that there are a lot of street vendors, right? Who are selling the same type of vegetables, exactly. They are selling the same type of fruits and all that stuff. So, right, very nice, right? So if you go there, right, so people have there are multiple stalls for the same thing, right? Couple of vendors selling the same type of fruits, vegetables, and things like that, right? Now, let's say if they're one 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So there are A, B, C, D, E, F, right? 6 vendors selling that product, same product right next to each other, right? So the idea is that prices are always fixed over there. When you go there, right? So let's say if this person is selling for $10 and this person is selling for $11 and this person is selling for $11.5 and this person is selling for $9.5, right? And so on and so forth, right? So the idea is that since they are located just right next to each other, you will directly go and buy from the person who is selling the cheapest, right? Yes or no? So prices cannot vary at all. And especially when the product is the same. It's not like you're going to a shoe store where you have different brands, or you're going to buy a soap where there are different brands, right? Brands are the same, because I'm giving you the example of vegetables, fruits, and so on, right? So there is absolutely no branding in that. Those are same type, right? And stuff like that. So you will go and directly buy from that person who is selling the cheapest, right? So what happens eventually, that prices come down to the same level, right? So whatever the price level is, more or less is not a concern right now. But whatever price will be, it will always be the same for all these. So this type of market is known as perfect competition. This type of market where there are a lot of producers or sellers who are selling the same product, where there's no branding, the quality is the same. It's known as perfect competition. That's what I was saying, that we'll study more about this in A2. But I did give you some idea that there are a lot of sellers who are selling the same type of product for the same price. That's known as perfect competition, right? So in that case, the demand for any one particular firm, its competitive market fee will higher the price, no one will buy from. Exactly. So if anyone is charging a higher price, no one will buy from. Exactly, right? So in such a market where which we call as perfect competition, so your demand curve looks like this, where prices are fixed at whatever level it is, and at that price you can buy whatever quantity you need to, and at that price you can buy whatever quantity you need to. Easy? We good, students? Now let's talk about the value. Let's talk about the value of price elasticity of demand. So what can we think about the value? Okay, now think about this. Let's go back to the same, go back to the formula that we were looking at. Now in this perfectly elastic demand curve that looks like this, as I've just shown you, right? Perfectly elastic demand curve that looks like this. So you have price on the y-axis, you have quantity demanded on the x-axis, right? So price is not changing, demand is changing. Price is fixed, I just told you, right? So this price, whatever it is, right? Let's say $10, $9, whatever, right? So price is fixed, but you can buy whatever quantity. So in the denominator, we know for a fact it will always be a zero. When price is not changing in the denominator, it will always be zero. In the numerator, it can be any value, 10, 12% change, 15% change, whatever it is, right? Now, whenever you divide a number with zero, what do you get? Whenever you divide a number with zero, what do you get? You get infinity, exactly, right? So, I mean, infinity, it will show you as a maths error. So if you input this value as it is, 10 divided by 0 or 20 divided by 0 on your calculator, that often says maths error. So technically that's an infinity value, like too big to calculate, right? Infinity, it never ends, right? So, right. So it's maths error. You can't really predict what the value is, right? So coming back to the point, the value of perfectly elastic demand curve will be infinity. The value of perfectly elastic demand curve will be infinity, right? And the value of this perfectly inelastic demand curve was zero. Khadija, Khizr, is everything clear on this? Now let's keep moving. And now comes in the final type of price elasticity of demand. So far we have talked about more elastic, less elastic, perfectly inelastic demand, and perfectly elastic demand. Now comes in the fifth and the last type of price elasticity of demand, and that is known as unitary elastic. That's known as unitary elastic. Now there is a demand curve that looks like this, as I've drawn in front of you, right? Now it's apparently a normal demand curve that is downward sloping. Like I did tell you at the start of our discussion about demand, that the demand curve, we do say it's curved, but most of the times we'll be making it as a straight line, but you can also make it down a downward sloping curve like this, right? So whether you make the demand curve like this or you make the demand curve like B, I mean, it doesn't make any difference, right? It doesn't make any difference, right? Because it shows inverse relationship. As long as inverse relationship is being shown, that doesn't make any difference, right? So let's say at point A, price was $10 and the total demand was $100 in the market. Then when the price drops down a little bit from let's say $8, from 10 to $8, the quantity demanded increased to 120, and then so on and so forth, right? This is point B and so on, right? Now, for the unitary elastic demand curve, unitary elastic, what's the idea? That the change in demand is proportionate to the change in price. Change in demand is proportionate to the change in price, right? So let's not take the example of the last one. Let's look at the two values. Okay, now let's calculate. And in fact, this will also give us the chance to do some, calculation part, right? Now, students, think about this. If you're moving from A to B, can we calculate the price elasticity of demand? Exactly, that's equal. So what is the percentage change in demand? Let's calculate that. So if you're moving from A to B, what's the new demand? So the new demand is 120. What was your previous demand? 100, 120. Just give me a second, right? So that's 120. Your previous quantity demanded was 100. Your previous quantity demanded was 100. New minus old divided by old into 100. That is how we do it, right? So 20 divided by 100 into 100, these two simply get cancelled out. So your percentage change in demand is 20%. Easy, is this simple? Now let's calculate the percentage change in price. How much is your percentage change in price? So what you actually do is you calculate what's the new price here. The new price is 8. New minus, because you're moving from A to B, 10 divided by 10 into 100. Yes or no, right? So that also gives you negative 2 over 10. So this gives you 10. This also gives you overall, you do the calculation, negative 20. So the change in price is negative 20. The change in demand is 20. Now, when you plug in the values, final values, so percentage change in demand is positive 20. Demand is increasing by 20% and your price is decreasing by 20%. So we do know that PED always give you a negative value, but the overall answer turns out to be negative 1. The overall value turns out to be negative 1. Yes or no? Now, this is basically what is known as unitary elastic demand. Now, do you remember I explained you what proportionate means yesterday? In yesterday's class, I told you what what proportionate means, right? So proportionate means in proportion. So proportion means that if I say that, think about this. If let's say you make a cup of coffee, right? And I say that keep the proportion same, but make 2 cups. So this is 1 cup. Now I want you to make 2 cups, but the proportion should be the same, right? Now think about this. If previously you were using 50% milk and 50% water in your coffee, right? Now you'll keep the same proportion. So you'll have 50% again for each cup, 50% of the total quantity, right? So let's say in this, you will using 50 ml of milk and 50 ml of water, right? To make your coffee. Now, if you're making 2 cups, how much quantity of milk will you use? How much quantity of milk will you use? Now, if you have to make 2 cups of coffee, right? You have to make 2 cups of coffee, right? So you'll just double the quantity, right? Exactly. No, if you have to make 2 cups, right? So that will just double the quantity, right? So now you will use 100 ml of milk, right? So proportion is still the same. You're not changing the proportion, and 100 ml of water. So proportion would have changed if you would have used, right? Let's say 60 ml of milk and 80 ml of water. Now that will put it out of proportion, right? Because the milk and water are not in the same proportion. Yes or no? So in this case, in these 2 cases, the proportion is the same. The only difference is that here it will make you 1 cup, here it will make you 2 cups, right? But here the proportion is different because now there's more water being used compared to milk, right? Got it? So proportion just means if it's a 10%, it should be 10%. The other quantity should also change by 10%. If it's 20%, right? Just give me a second. Right? If it's increasing by 20%, one quantity is increasing by 20%, the other quantity should also increase by 20%, so on. Any confusion, and the value of this PED is unitary elasticity of demand will always be -1. But you do know that we ignore the negative sign. Negative sign is just showing you the inverse relationship between the two variables, right? Price and demand. But you can say that unitary elastic demand would have either a value of 1 or it will have a value of -1. Doesn't make any difference, but that's what you need to remember. So now, is there any confusion that's not clear? Anything that you want to ask me, anything there's doubt about, and so on? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Amazing. Amazing. Okay, now let's keep moving. Now, this brings us, Khadija and Khizr, is this clear? So if this is clear, then we'll move on and we'll start off with the new topic today, which is known as price elasticity of supply. Now, what is price elasticity of supply? Let me tell you. Price elasticity of supply is doing the same thing for supply, what you were doing, what price elasticity of demand was doing for demand, right? Now think about this. Price elasticity, right? So just by the name, you can tell that it will calculate the responsiveness of product supply due to change in product price. A formula that calculates responsiveness of quantity demanded due to change in product price, right? Sorry, quantity not demanded, sorry, this is supply. The responsiveness of quantity supplied due to change in price. Now think about this. When price of a product increases, we do know that supply will always increase, right? So there's always one-on-one relationship. Do you agree with me or not? So there is always one-on-one relationship, like, direct relationship, what I meant. So there's always direct relationship between price and supply. We do know this due to the law of demand that we've already discussed, right? So think about this. So supply curve for any product is always upward sloping. We do know this, and this is what law of supply says. More the price, higher the quantity supplied. Why? Because the logic is fairly simple and easy, that it's more profitable to produce a product. If it's becoming more expensive meaning, like, you know, if let's say previously something was selling for $10 and the cost of producing was $5, right? Then this means that on each unit, the producer was saving $5, right? So $10 was the price of that good, which was, you know, for which it was sold in the market, whereas cost of producing that good was $5. So on each unit, you were saving $5. Now, if the price has jumped to $15 and the cost of production has still stayed the same, it still costs you $5 to produce, but it's selling for $15 in the market. So how much is your profit now? How much is your profit now? Your profit is $10. Confusion? Confusion, students? Anything that's not clear? Anything you want to ask me? Anything? Yeah. We good? Are we good? Okay, can we move on? Right. So this being said, we do know that since it's more profitable to produce a product when the price is higher, therefore it will be an upward sloping graph, right? Okay. But how much response would supply show to change in price? That is what we don't know. And that is what the price elasticity of supply calculates. Now think about this. So we have two supply curves on the graph, label it A and B, right? Now, which of the two supply curves is more elastic and which of the two supply curves is less elastic? Can you guess? Which of the two supply curves is more elastic and which of the two supply curves is less elastic? Right. So, right. Okay. Thank you, Zuhan. Let me ask the other students. Yeah. So your answer is correct. Yeah. Which one is more elastic? Which one is less elastic? Yeah. Yeah. Great. Perfect. What about other students? Khadija, Khizr? Can you guys guess? Okay, now think about this. The idea is the same logic prevails, but I'll show you again in case you still have any confusions, right? B is what? B is what? More, less, right? So have a look at this. Let's assume this was the initial price for both the products, right? And at this price, obviously, as you can see that the two supply curves are intersecting, so the total quantity supplied was 100. B is more elastic, exactly. So when the price increases from P1 to P2, which of the two is showing a bigger change? Which of the two is showing a bigger change in supply when the price increases from P1 to P2? Now have a look at this. Now your supply has increased from 100 to 120, right? Whereas in the other case, for the supply curve B, your quantity supplied has increased from 100 to 160. Yes or no? 100 to 160. So what it shows that for supply curve A, there was only a change of 20 units, whereas for supply curve B, there was a change of 60 units. There was a change of 60 units. Yes or no, right? So B is showing more change in supply due to change in price. So it's more elastic, right? And A is less elastic. Does it make sense, students? A is less elastic. Are we good? Right. Okay. So again, if you look at the formula, if you look at the logic that I told you, right? Rule of thumb. Rule of thumb was what? If anything is steep, that's less elastic. So A1 is more steep. A is steep, right? So just imagine a guy walking on this thing, right? Like this. And then compare this with someone hiking up on this one. So you just by looking at the picture, you can tell that hike on B is easier compared to A. A is much more steep compared to B. Compared to B. So if it's steep, it's less elastic. If it's steep, it's inelastic or less elastic. If it's less steep like B, it's more elastic. So I'm writing inelastic in front of this, and this would be your more, that would be your more elastic, right? We good? Any confusion, anything that's not clear? Right, perfect. Now let's look at the formula. So formula also stays the same. So price elasticity of supply, the only difference between price elasticity of supply and price elasticity of demand would be that in the numerator, as far as the formula is concerned, so percentage change in quantity supplied of a good divided by percentage change in price. That's what the formula is, right? Percentage change in price of the good. Now think about this. If supply is changing more than proportionately, that's known as more elastic. Now, if I give you a value, you have to tell me. So if for 2% change in price, there is 10% change in supply, what will be the overall answer? Just by looking at this, you can tell the overall answer will be 5. Now, is it more elastic, less elastic? Is it more elastic? So if there's a value of 5 for price elasticity of supply for any product, would you classify it as more elastic, less elastic? And what's the logic? Yes, it's greater than 1. Yes, very nice. And secondly, it's showing more than proportionate change. So for 2% change in price, there's 10% change in supply, which is more than proportionate, right? So change in supply is greater than change in price. Therefore, it is more than proportionate. Confusion? Right? We good? Okay. Now, similarly, if there is another example, let's say for 15% change in price, there's 5% change in supply, right? Now we do know that this overall value will turn out to be 0.333. You can also use a calculator. Calculators are allowed on the exam. So since this value is less than 1, so it is less than proportionate change, because for 15% change in price, there was only 5% change in supply. So this is less than proportionate, right? And therefore it is less elastic. So less than proportionate is less elastic, more than proportionate is more elastic. Any confusion so far, students? Anything that's not clear, right? Okay. Now, what about the sign? Can any one of you tell me what will be the sign of price elasticity of supply? We do know that the price elasticity of demand has a sign of negative. Would that be negative in this case? Would that be negative? And the answer is no. Why? Because obviously it's an upward sloping graph. You can see for yourself, it's an upward sloping graph, right? So higher the price, higher the price, higher the quantity supplied. So it's an upward sloping graph. Therefore, it's right positive. It will always be positive. We good? Can you move on? Right? Okay. Now, this being said, let's understand theoretically that what price elasticity of supply shows. What type of products will have more elastic supply and what type of products will have less elastic supply. So for that, we are about to discuss factors affecting PES, factors affecting price elasticity of supply. Okay, now think about this, students. If it's relatively easy, now you have to listen to this carefully. If it's relatively easy to produce a product, right, then its supply will be more elastic. And if it's the opposite, if it's difficult to produce, right, exactly, the one that takes less time to be produced will be more elastic, the availability, exactly, right? So the rule of thumb is, I'm writing this down because that will help you remember and, kind of tell that what product has more elastic supply and what product has less elastic supply. So rule of thumb says, if something is relatively easy to produce in terms of time, in terms of resources, then it will be more elastic, right? And if something is relatively difficult to produce, like in terms of time, it's a more time consuming process, or it takes more resources, as I'll give you examples in a bit, that will be less elastic, right? Easy to produce in terms of time and other things as well. It's not just the time and resources. It's more elastic and vice versa. Right? We good on this? Students, any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? Exactly. Right. So products that take longer to produce, like vegetables, fruits, right? Mangoes, yeah, that will have less elastic supply. Okay, great, perfect, excellent. Right. So do remember this rule of thumb, because that will really help you to differentiate what products have more elastic supply and what products have less elastic supply. So if something is relatively easy to produce in terms of time and resources, then it is more elastic. And if it's difficult to produce, then it will be less elastic. So the first factor we have already discussed, right? So the first factor is the nature of the good, right? So you can say nature of good. So if I ask you, right, uh, an example, if I ask you a question, let's say we are comparing two things. So let's say cell phones, just think about the process of producing a cell phone versus producing a product like commercial plane, right? The commercial plane in which we travel between countries, you know that, right? Or fighter plane or whatever, right? Something too big. Now, for which of the two products would you expect the supply to be more elastic? Out of these two products, which product would you expect the supply to be more elastic? Right, a candy or a car, exactly, right? Kind of good example, right? So candy is a much smaller product compared to a car, so that should be more elastic, less elastic. It requires less resources, it requires less time. The complication it is like you just need to mix some ingredients, put some flavor, I don't know, heat it, cold it, whatever do you do with that, and then you package it and you deliver it to the customers. For a fighter plane or a car, just imagine, I mean, you need different components, it's a big production plant. You need to make sure that you have skilled labor to produce those cars and so on, right? So if the price of candy is going up, producing more candies should be no problem at all, right? Or producing a cake or something of the sort, right? So producing more candies, if price is going up, I mean, should perhaps take you 1 day, 2 day. You can easily increase your supply in 1 day or 2 day. You can just hire some additional people. You can just get some more, inputs, ingredients, and you can increase your output of candies. But if the price of other thing, like prices also increase, if the price of cars is also increasing by the same amount, but is that equally easy to increase the supply of cars? What do you think? So if the price of candy is increasing by 10%, whatever it was previously, now there's a 10% increase in the price of candies, and there's 10% increase in the price of cars. Can you increase the supply of cars overnight? Can you increase the supply of cars overnight? That's my question to you. No, it will take some time, right? First of all, you'll see whether you have enough capacity in your plant. Then you'll see whether you have enough people. If you don't, then you'll need to hire more people, or you will need to use existing, or you will need to put more shifts for the existing staff. Then you'll make sure whether all the components that are used in the car manufacturing are available, not available, blah, 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 right? So there are a couple of different things that you need to consider, right? Huge amount of capital, hire more people, exactly. So the nature of the good. If it's relatively easy to produce, it's more elastic, difficult to produce, it's less elastic, right? So that was the first one. Second one, I've already kind of explained you, that is availability of resources needed to produce that good, right? So if you have more resources available, right? If you have more resources available to produce that thing, that should be more elastic, less elastic. So think about it. In Pakistan, we are an agriculture-based country, right? So we have a lot of fertile land. We have a lot of labor, manpower to produce agricultural goods, and so on. But we are not that good when it comes to technology, machines, and things like that, right? So for a country like Pakistan, we have more resources for agricultural goods compared to manufactured goods. Therefore, increasing the supply of agricultural goods should be much easier in our case compared to increasing the production of manufactured goods. Do you agree with me? Right? So that means, and then obviously there's also a seasonal effect that can be there. Yes, that's correct, right? So sometimes there are other conditions, right? Right? So generally, if we compare the two products, right? But yeah, that would be opposite to what we're discussing. But yeah, that's correct, Johan. Students, are you following me? So availability of resources. So if you have more resources available, so in Pakistan's case, we have more supply of agricultural resources to produce agricultural goods. So their supply will be relatively elastic, but we don't have much resources to produce manufactured goods. So their supply will be less elastic or inelastic, as we simply say, right? And then the last of all, but in other countries, where there's more technology, right? Like developed countries. So manufactured goods will have more supply and agricultural goods will have less supply. Is making sense, students? Is making sense? Anything that's not clear, anything you want to ask me, right? But there are a couple of other factors that we'll talk about, tomorrow, right? There are a few other factors that we'll talk about tomorrow, right? We good? Okay, then that would be Samsung just opened plant. Seriously? Oh, wow, that's a great news. Perfect. Let's discuss this tomorrow. Right. So I'll see you tomorrow, students. Have a good night. And we'll continue from here. Then that would be almost towards the completion of unit 2, but there will be few other topics left, like consumer surplus and producer surplus. So we'll talk about that, right? But I'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Have a good night. Allah Hafiz.